come as a major surprise because I was, involved in it in sort of trying to get them some information on it when I was asked about it and stuff when I was in India from sort of December onward. But I think the specific kinds of ways it was framed was like a very positive. It wasn't kind of this hardened position of like of where the Union has historically stood with Palestine, which is true, but it's also a kind of the position of the moral question of innocent civilians being hurt, and something I think a lot of people can really relate to. I think it's sort of significant in a number of ways, right? Firstly, India is presented by Israel and is seen by Israel as a kind of beachhead in politically legitimizing Israel. It's not a surprise if European countries, because Israel serves as a kind of satellite base for Western interests. It's not surprising when those countries come out in favor of Israel. It really undermines Palestinian solidarity when a country like India, which is historically been very pro-Palestine, has come out not necessarily diplomatically. Diplomatically, they've still, by and large, support the BRICS economies and not the historically imperialist countries, although they don't stick their neck out to do that. But in trade agreements and in military contracts, they've really broken with their historical ties to the non-aligned movement and obviously their current role within the BRICS. And this has really accelerated in the last 10 years. In particular, the movement of arms, commodities, goods throws a kind of wrench into the international Palestine solidarity movement. And so now when you have a major port union coming out and saying this, it's taken a lot of people by surprise. And it also speaks to how people don't understand that India is a federal system. South India, in particular, in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, historically have had very close ties to Palestine. And even now, if you look at Kerala, they broke up major contract in the weeks after the genocide began, after October 7th, that produced 100,000 police uniforms a year. A factory in Kerala said we will no longer produce this, which was took a lot of people by surprise. But then they had marches of hundreds of thousands of people and supported by the chief minister in Kerala, and that's because of their historical links to the left and then their ties to anti-imperialism. So to people within India, it didn't come as a surprise. If you look online, lots of people, especially sort of fascistically minded people were like, well, surprise, surprise, it comes from Kerala, or surprise, surprise, it comes from Kerala and Tamil Nadu. But for people outside of India, it was like, okay, it was a shock to a lot of people, and especially now because India is the largest producer, largest buyer of Israeli arms. But I think what's also significant is that it comes from ports and docks. Like if other trade unions put out statements, it's not as significant precisely because they're not at a critical choke point in the economy. Ports, docks, transport is what you call. Those choke points are places that it isn't easy to replace those facilities. And I can get into that a little bit later when we can discuss, the questions of logistics. But the reason why ports and docks are so important in shutting down the commodity process or the commodity chain or supply chains is because other sectors, like let's say you're an arms producer. In arms manufacturers historically haven't ever really said we'll no longer produce for this military campaign that's eviscerating people's lives. There is an exception, of course. I mean, I can the case of the Rolls-Royce factory in Scotland that in the 1970s and 80s refused to produce a specific engine that went into a specific plane that was headed to Chile after Allende was killed and Pinochet was put in. There's a great documentary about it called No Pass Around, but that was because that union was essentially a communist-controlled union, and the production for that specific was a very, very small proportion of the production process. So with that exception notwithstanding, historically, the only mechanisms really to put pressure in this kind of international realm has been ports and docks.
I can tell you that when we spoke to the General Secretary of the Union, he indicated that he was, first of all, surprised at how popular their statement was across the world. And he was so surprised that he didn't actually want to even answer the calls. He just thought they had taken a very humanistic and pro-people position, which he thought was quite normal. And he was surprised that others were surprised by that. But the other part of that is that he said it was actually difficult to carry out the strike, carry out the threat altogether. Can you tell us why that might have been the case? Why was it difficult to actually not let ships board with weapons? Or are there ships going with weapons? What is the actual situation of the transport of weaponry from India to Israel?
Right, yeah. So, I mean, there's two parts to that question. Firstly is that through containerization, which is the kind of mass container use of the kind of similar container or the same containers in transport, which makes it easier to move goods across the world, it becomes unclear to someone who's moving massive containers onto massive ships what's exactly on those containers. And so there's a question of information, which makes it very difficult for the union to confirm whether something has or hasn't been moved from India to Israel. We know that goods have moved from India to Israel. I mean, we know at least at Mundra port, which is one of the major ports that's private, that's controlled by, that's in Gujarat, that's controlled by Adani. But the other ports, which are other major ports, which are government ports, where the Water Transport Workers Union have some power, uneven, depends on the port. In Kochi port, they have a lot of power. In Chennai, they have some power. They're not the major union there. In Mangalore, they also have some power, but they're not the major union there. But in some of the ports in the north, they have very little power, even if they have membership. They wouldn't, in those places, have the power to refuse moving those goods because workers from other unions or non-union members would move those goods. So there's a kind of functional question there. But then there's also the information question. So a really kind of case study of this and the case study for a lot of Palestine activists is the international campaign around ending apartheid in South Africa. And so, because there's so many similarities, and that was such a successful campaign, not only because the African National Congress, which was the sort of militant organization that led the struggle against apartheid, but also the international secondary pressures that were put on by different unions and campaigns around the world to economically choke South Africa in solidarity with the struggle of anti-apartheid activists. So in 1984, the Maritime Union Against Apartheid, the MUAA, was created after there was a series of unions around the world in places like California, a very kind of militant union, the International Longshoremen Workers Union, which was very communist for a very long time, or at least had strong communist links. But then also other unions around the world with individual actions decided to come together, led really by the Danish port workers, but also with the support of the British and Australian dock workers, in order to stop from moving to South Africa, primarily and almost exclusively the shipping of oil supplies, because that was something that South Africa didn't have access to, and it was a way to really affect. It was a kind of key vulnerability in that country, and at the time, there was the creation or the kind of support of the Shipping Research Bureau, which was an Amsterdam-based institute, the SRB, in order to research where these oil shipments were happening, like what time, which shipment, and that was a crucial mechanism, that research facility, to allow for these unions to track it down and shut it down and actually enforce this boycott. And one of the key unions, there were 30 unions around the world that in 1985 came together in a conference to try to enforce this worldwide. One of the key unions that joined that was Water Transport Workers Union Federation in India. And so they really helped ramp up that kind of boycott. So this isn't something new to this union federation, and it isn't new to the Communist Party Marxists in India in general, who have historically been very close and had strong links to liberation struggles with Palestine, specifically the Popular Fund for the Liberation of Palestine, a sort of Marxist-Leninist political organization within Palestine. And so there's a few things there. We need similar research to be done now.
Have there been any workers' strikes at all in these last 150 days, which have managed to thwart Israel's plans at all? We haven't heard of any, besides for, again, the Kerala uniform makers, but that was not a workers' decision as much as a company decision, I think.
Yeah, okay. So there, as far as I know, there isn't a specific organization, and there isn't a kind of continuity. I mean, this, again, almost 40 years ago, and once the end of apartheid happened, these campaigns, a lot of them metastasized into different organizations or sort of dissolved. But I think that there are a number of academics and others who write about logistics, myself included, that have come together to try and specifically, Workers for a Free Palestine, which is an organization, sort of like overarching organization that's trying to do some research, has done some research. And so we're trying to get that off the ground, specifically with containers, to try and track down not only the goods that could be going directly to Israel, but parts. So the parts that are going to places like, the Adani drone factory in Hyderabad, that could be, and those could also be targets to stop moving goods. The problem is in India, we produce a lot internally. And so any of the goods that are produced internally are for Indian consumption. And I can get into that in a minute, but to answer the question, there has been a number of actions around the world. If you look at in Belgium, the three major transport unions announced, this was back in October, that they would not move any weapons to Israel by land, by air, or sea. And so that was, and then shortly after, the government Wallonia, which is the majority French-speaking part of Belgium, is one of three parts in Israel, banned all arms goods to Israel, and they had specific ones around, like, around gunpowder, and they suspended those licenses. And I mean, you can't delink those two issues, right? The union's pressure, and then simultaneously, it's kind of a dialectical relationship. But shortly after that, the unions announced in Belgium, the Barcelona dock workers declared they would refuse to move goods, arms, to and from, load and unload to Israel. And then shortly after that, Spain instituted an arms ban on Israel. Again, you can't delink this question. The Dutch government, again, not tied to necessarily union pressure, announced that they would stop producing they banned the export of parts produced for the F-35 fighter jet, which was being used in Gaza, citing specifically the risk of violations of international law. Also, factories have been upset. The arms factory pressure has been a central part of the campaign right now. If you look at Workers for Free Palestine in Britain, has been doing mass blockades to stop the production of goods. This is also happening in the US, Britain, and Europe with Palestine Action, where it's sort of a direct action group going directly and sort of destroying the arms factories that produce directly. This is specifically for Elbit and other companies that produce for Israel. So that's been a major target. And there's been some action. And there was also a European Day of Action with European dock workers, 12 refusing to move goods, Day of Peace that happened one day. This was in December. And so there's sort of actions building up. Of course, it isn't happening as quickly and as broadly and as deeply as one would hope, considering the level and degree of violence. But I think these things begin to accelerate as more and more announcements happen and actions are taken.
So what can you tell us about how the Houthis, the Ansar Allah of Yemen, have their actions in stopping ships, physically stopping ships from moving through the strait? What can you tell us about how effective that has been? Is that coordinated? That's not coordinated at all with the unions. That's an entirely independent action.
Yeah, look, I think that's not that. They effectively control Yemen. I mean, this is often contested within the Western media. Say, oh, they don't control. This is a rebel group, etc. The government, they control Sana'a. That's the seat of power. 90% of the population live there. The geography, you can say, oh, there's the government that's controlled by the West in Saudi Arabia doesn't really exist. They exist in the Ritz-Carlton. They live in the Ritz-Carlton effectively Riyadh. But the government of Yemen, which is the Ansar Allah, which the West calls Houthis, it have taken this action to do a naval blockade. Now, why is this quite significant? And this is the first time in history, in recorded history, that you've seen a successful naval blockade from a country with no navy. And the reason for that is because, well, look, navies are the most expensive part of any country's military. And so you have to be a very wealthy country, not only to have a navy, but a navy capable of enforcing a naval blockade. It's an enormous amount of resources. But Ansar Allah has been able to do it not only because of the sense of deep solidarity that they feel towards the struggle of Palestinians and the violence they're seeing to try and stop that, but also because of access to affordable and high-tech technology. It's the first time also in history that you've seen this level of technology that's also relatively affordable for a country like Yemen. I mean, also Yemen has ballistic missiles. Let's remember that the Ansar Allah isn't an organization that has just small suicide drones that they send out to ships. But it's also, so there's that factor that they have that control, that they can do that. But it's also because of the shifting dynamics within capitalism. So capitalism is shaped by a number of laws of motion, as Marx, building on Smith, and Ricardo says. These laws of motion means that capitalism develops in a certain kind of way. And one of those laws of motion is competition. Competition is a motion that happens within capitalism. Hyper-capitalization, competition leads to smaller firms falling out and bigger firms becoming bigger and bigger, essentially. That is a law within capitalism that happens regardless of the sort of contingencies within any specific political realities or economic realities. So what does that mean? What does that mean? That means that shipping industry has become more and more monopolized. So a handful of shipping firms own an enormous amount of global shipping. And what that's meant is that, by shutting down about 10 different shipping firms, 80% of the shipping that would go through the Port of Eden and the Red Sea, which is where the blockade is happening, the Ansar Allah blockade, 80% of that is collapsed. And because these firms become more and more monopolized, and they're publicly traded companies. I mean, these are the companies like Maersk or Yang Ying or CMA CGM or Frontline. These companies become very large, and they invest in huge ships. Those ships means that you have higher sort of economies of scale, and so those massive ships can only dock in a handful of ports. I mean, for example, India has dozens and dozens of ports, but these ships can only dock in about 12 or 13 ports. Similarly, in Israel has officially 8 or 9 ports, I think, but the ones where these ships can actually dock in are Ashdod and Haifa. Haifa, if it's like this, Haifa's here, Ashdod is here, and Eilat is here. Eilat's where is the end point of the port of the Red Sea blockade, right? So Eilat, shipping to Eilat has collapsed by 80%. The economy of Eilat's in shambles. So it's been a very effective way of enforcing it. How have they been able to do it? Because the investment in these ships are worth way more than any of the actual goods on the ship. The ships themselves are worth so much, and because of monopolization and concentration of capital, it's meant that if the risk to any of these ships at any given time means that the insurance costs on it, the liabilities go so high that the insurance costs are more expensive and more liable and more pricey to the owners than any of the goods on the actual ship. So the risk to any of these ships, you sink a few ships, means that they're no longer willing, and they announced, they're like, we're not gonna move any of these. So all of these companies, big companies, announced it. And some kind of companies like Hong Kong-based OOCL, which is a major shipping company, or Taiwanese-based Evergreen, not only announced that they're not moving goods through the Cape of Good through the Gulf of Eden, moving it to Cape of Good Hope, which are a number of others, which increased the cost to these shipping goods by 20%. So that's having an add-on effect to the Israeli economy. they said that we're not shipping any goods to and from Israel, from now on, because Ansarallah announced not only are they going to target any ship that's moving directly to Israel, but they'll target any ship that's moving any goods at any time to Israel. So companies that have continued to move goods to Israel, like Maersk and others, have been still targeted by Israel. But other companies like OCL or Evergreen haven't been targeted, precisely because they've refused to move any goods by any path, whether it be Koifa Hope to Haifa, for example. So it's not only because of the changing dynamics of technology, the will of the Yemeni people to support the Palestinian struggle, but also the changing contours and dynamics of the composition of capitalism that has led to this kind of perfect storm of allowing the Ansar Allah to enforce this very effective naval blockade.
So if you're saying 80% of the shipping has been blocked, do you have any sense of what impact that has had on the Israeli economy and the Israeli war machine?
Well, look, there's 3 ports, right? So the 80% in Eliyat port, which is the one that have collapsed, but that's not 80% overall. But we know that the Israeli economy, recently it was announced there's been a 20% contraction in the Israeli economy. I think that's a pretty conservative number. I think it's much more than that. If they weren't being supported directly by the U.S. government with tens of billions of dollars, both of arms and aid, which is financial transfers to that government, they would be, basically the economy would have all but collapsed. That's for a number of reasons, being, partly because of the collapse in the economy, because of the reduction in commodities, but also the war economy has taken an enormous amount of resources. Also, because they have these massive reservists, 350,000 reservists, come out of the labor market into the Israeli army. But also, you see that many Israelis have left Israel. There was a report that many of them are going to neighboring countries, or countries like Cyprus and others have seen the influx of a lot of Israelis. You've also seen that in the Gaza envelope, more than 80,000 people, that's the area around Gaza, 80,000 people have moved to Tel Aviv. You have 200,000 people from the north, because of attacks by Hezbollah, have moved to Tel Aviv. So that puts enormous amounts of pressure both on housing and the state's welfare provision, because obviously the state is supporting them to do this. So all of these forms of pressure, even recently, for example, I was just in the shop, I've just arrived back in London. None of the dates, for example, or goods in my local shop, which historically would have said, say, may have been from Israel in a kind of, they are like explicitly saying for Ramadan, oh, this is from Palestine, etc. And I read a recent report that they haven't been able to sell these goods across the world. So it's having a real effect on the Israeli sort of export-oriented economy.
Bill, I think we'll wrap it up now, Professor Kumar. Thank you very much for all the insight and information that you've been able to give us. It's been wonderful. So much of what we have to do is just piece together information. So you've been tracking it and you've been able to share it with us. So thank you.